There's a certain joy in finding you here again, my friends. Those of you who see films not just as entertainment, but as portals into the human condition. You've always been the kind of people who understand that cinema, when done with intention, can read like a novel, sing like poetry, and linger like the scent of an old book pulled from a quiet shelf. Welcome back to Cinema Vault. If you haven't yet, consider subscribing, not because it's some mechanical step in a YouTube ritual, but because I want you here for the conversations, for the little discoveries, for that feeling we get when we crack open a story together and let its meaning spill across the table. Tonight, I'm bringing you something unusual, something that isn't about surface pleasures or popcorn spectacle. This is not a real movie review. No, what we're doing is far more curious. Think of it as a thought experiment disguised as a critical analysis, a literary excavation into a work that exists in imagination as much as it does in frame. The film in question is Last Prisoner, 2025, and I'm inviting you to enter it with me not as passive spectators, but as co-authors of the ideas it stirs. We're not here to decide whether it's good or bad in the usual sense. We're here to feel its undercurrents, to follow the threads it weaves into our own lives. The first time I saw it, and I say first because certain films demand a return, I remember leaning back afterwards, my mind unusually quiet. Not empty, but quiet, as if it knew better than to rush toward an easy opinion. Some works hand you their meaning like a sealed envelope. This one left on the table, half open, daring you to read only when you were ready. That sensation of a film granting you space to interpret is rare, and it reminded me of reading Camus in my early 20s, when I realized that some truths aren't told outright, but are instead hinted at, like the shadow of a passing bird whose wings you never actually see. On the surface, the film is deceptively simple. A man imprisoned for decades finally finds himself on the edge of release. But the story isn't about freedom in the way we usually think of it. Instead, it's about the strange disorientation that comes when the walls that shaped your world are suddenly gone. It's about time as a living thing, about the way years can carve notches into a soul, smoothing some edges, sharpening others. There's a kind of patient cruelty in how it unfolds. Scenes stretch longer than you expect. Silences carry weight, and even the smallest details, like the way light falls across the concrete floor, seem to be telling you something you can't quite name. I won't spoil everything. Not yet. But I will tell you this. What appears to be a straightforward narrative about a man leaving prison becomes something altogether stranger and more unsettling. There are moments that made me think of dreams I've had where I finally leave a place I've been trapped in, only to realize I'm still inside, that the world beyond is just another layer of confinement. It's as if the film knows we carry our prisons with us. And sometimes they're not made of stone or steel, but of memory, guilt, or even love. There's one sequence, and forgive me if I sound a little haunted when I talk about it, where our protagonist steps out into the night for the first time in years. It should be triumphant. Instead, the air feels too sharp, the sky too wide, the noise of the city almost hostile. The shot lingers on his face, and though he says nothing, you can see it all there, the dawning realization that freedom is just a different kind of loneliness. I've felt that before, not in the literal sense, but in those moments when a long-fought struggle ends and you're left with the question, now what? That's what I love about this story. It's never content to stay on one level. It's not just a meditation on incarceration. It's an exploration of identity, of how we're shaped by the boundaries around us, and how terrifying it can be to live without them. There's an almost mythic quality to it, the way the world beyond the prison is rendered. Streets curve in impossible ways. People speak in fragments, as if language itself has grown rusty in his absence. Even light behaves differently, sometimes harsh and sterile, sometimes warm and almost unbearably nostalgic. And then, of course, there are the twists. I won't rob you of their impact, but I will tease them. Just when you think you've mapped the narrative, when you believe you understand trajectory, the film tilts. It doesn't yank the rug out from under you so much as quietly rotate the room you're standing in, so that the door you thought led out now opens into a place you've already been. It's that circularity, that quiet revelation that the end might be the beginning reframed, that gives it the texture of a great short story rather than a conventional film. I'll admit something here. Watching it stir memories I didn't expect. There was a summer in my own life when I moved to a city where I knew no one. It wasn't a prison, not literally. But in those first months, the silence of my apartment and the alien rhythms of the streets made me feel just as cut off. I'd wander for hours, try to memorize the turns, the shops, the way the air smelled near the river. It was an exercise in relearning the world and myself from scratch. That sensation is woven deep into this film, as if it understands that even the most mundane acts, ordering coffee, crossing a street, can be monumental when you've been away from life as it's usually lived. The pacing will test some viewers. I can already imagine people complaining that nothing happens for long stretches, but those stretches are where the real substance lives. They're the literary equivalent of white space on a page, the places where the reader, or in this case the viewer, is meant to insert their own breath, their own reflection. And isn't that what art should do? Not just speak, but listen. Of course, the technical craft deserves its due. The cinematography doesn't just capture, it communicates. The way shadows stretch and sell, the way light burns too brightly outside. It's as if the camera itself is adjusting, struggling to recalibrate to this shifting reality. The sound design, too, is meticulous. You hear the hum of fluorescent lights in the prison, the muffled echo of footsteps, the distant drip of water, and then outside, the overwhelming chaos of life. Car horns, snippets of laughter, the rustle of leaves and wind. These auditory details are not decoration. They're part of the story's heartbeat. But what stays with me most is how the film treats time. Not as a line, but as something more elastic, more personal. In prison, days stretch like chewing gum. Outside, they snap like dry twigs. The editing mirrors as beautifully, long, unbroken takes inside, quick, almost breathless cuts outside. It's the sort of structural choice that might pass unnoticed by a casual viewer, but for those attuned to it, it's a quiet revelation. As we move toward the heart of the story, the boundaries between inner and outer life blur. Flashbacks seep in, but they don't arrive as cleanly labeled memories. Instead, they drift through scenes like faint smells or half-heard music, catching you off guard. There's a particular one, involving a letter never sent, that hit me harder than I expected. It's not melodramatic. It's almost too small to notice. But in that moment, I thought of all the unsent letters in my own life, the things I'd meant to say but never did, and how those silences have shaped me as much as the words I have spoken. And then the turn, the kind of shift that makes you question everything you've seen so far. Without spoiling the mechanics, I'll say this. The idea of release takes on a new meaning, one that's less about walking through a gate and more about stepping into a truth you've been avoiding. It's an ending that doesn't hand you resolution on a silver platter. Instead, it invites you to carry it with you, to let it rattle around in your mind for days. I left the theater, or rather, my living room, since I watched it alone on a quiet night, with that peculiar mix of satisfaction and ache that comes from encountering something that knows more than it's willing to say. I made tea. I sat in the dim light, and I thought about how, in some way, we're all waiting to be released from something, whether it's fear, habit, expectation, or the small invisible prisons we build ourselves. If you choose to see it, and I hope you do, don't go in expecting answers. Go in expecting questions. Expect to be patient. Expect to feel a little lost at times. That's part of the gift. It's not a film that tries to convince you of anything. It simply lays out its world and trusts you to find your own way through it. That's rare. And for those of us who love stories that treat us as thinkers, as feelers, as people capable of holding contradictions, it's a treasure. So, my dear literature lovers, let's carry this one with us. Let's talk about it, argue over it, let it change shape as we revisit it in memory. And if you've been with me here at Cinema Vault for a while, you know that's the kind of journey I cherish most. Not the ones that tell us where to go, but the ones that hand us the map and whisper, the rest is up to you. It begins not with noise, but with the absence of it, a kind of hollow, stretched silence that seems to bend the air in the room. There's an image, grainy, half-lit, of a man sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, his hands clasped so tightly that the skin around his knuckles has gone pale. You notice, even before you're meant to, that his fingernails are chipped, the kind of detail filmmakers often skip. But here it's deliberate. His eyes don't blink much. They just hover in the space between the floor and some invisible point in his head. From the moment we see him, there's an odd sense that the room is smaller than it really is. The walls are plain, yet the camera lingers on them, giving them the kind of oppressive weight that makes you feel you're looking at someone's mind made visible. It's only when the sound of a door latch clicks, a sound sharp enough to cut through quiet, that we realize this is not a home, and this is not a man at leisure. The figure that enters is a guard, but not the kind of movies usually glamorize. There's no theatrical sneer or swagger, just a weary mechanical precision, like a worker operating a machine they've grown numb to. He doesn't speak. He just places a tray of food on the floor, slides it forward with his boot, and leaves. The man on the bed doesn't reach for it. He waits, as though eating would be a kind of surrender, and then comes the first flicker of motion that really matters. He turns his head, slowly, toward the wall opposite him. There's a faint scratch there, thin and jagged. Not something you'd notice unless you've been staring at the same wall for months, maybe years. The camera draws us toward it. And in that moment, you realize the film isn't simply about confinement in the physical sense. It's about what the mind does when it has nowhere else to go. We're shown fragments of his life before this place. Not in clear, cheerful flashbacks, but in broken pieces, as if someone had torn photographs in half and left only the corners. A child's laughter in a courtyard. The smell of warm bread wafting from a bakery. The sensation of rain on the back of his neck as he ran through a narrow alley. None of these images linger for more than a few seconds. They pass away, thoughts pass when you're trying not to think at all. But then comes a sound, the one that changes everything. It's faint, like a piece of paper sliding across stone. He freezes, listening. Again, there it is. A slow, deliberate scraping from somewhere beyond the wall. His breath catches, and for a moment you see something close to hope in his eyes. He moves closer, presses his ear against the cold concrete, and waits. The sound stops. He knocks once, very lightly. 3 seconds pass, and then a knock in return. It's here that I felt the film had me completely. That small, almost imperceptible exchange carries more weight than any dramatic rescue scene could. Because what we're watching is the first fragile thread of connection forming in a place designed to sever all ties. The knocking becomes their language. At first, it's just presence. I'm here. Are you there? Then it becomes something more deliberate, a pattern of short and long taps that they both seem to intuitively understand. No subtitles, no explanatory dialogue, just a rhythm of human persistence against the backdrop of isolation. Parallel to this, we see fragments of his past life starting to arrange themselves into something like a narrative. A young woman, her face mostly obscured by light, stands in a kitchen talking, though we can't hear her words. A group of men in a small, dimly lit room whispering urgently, maps and papers scattered on the table between them. His own voice, louder now, speaking words that sound like they were meant to be hidden. The genius of these moments is how they blur. You're never sure if you're watching memories or imaginings. Are these scenes as they happened, or as he wishes they had happened? The ambiguity keeps you leaning forward, searching for clues in the way a gesture lingers or an object appears twice in 2 different contexts. And then, almost without warning, we're in a new environment. The lighting shifts, the frame breathes a little more, and suddenly he's outside. No walls, no guards. He's standing in an open field at dusk, wind bending the grass, his face lifted toward the sky. The sound here is rich, crickets, the distant hum of traffic, the soft crackle of something burning. But just when you're starting to believe in this liberation, a hard cut pulls you back into the cell. The tray of food is still on the floor, untouched. The scratching on the wall has stopped. The change is so abrupt that you feel it physically, like stepping from sunlight into shadow. And this is where the tension begins to creep. Not the loud, pulse-quickening kind, but the kind that makes your stomach feel tight. The knocks don't return that night. Or the next. He starts pacing, something we've never seen him do before, counting steps under his breath. It's as though the absence of that small connection has undone whatever fragile balance he had managed to build. Then one morning, the sound returns, but it's different. The rhythm is off, uneven, almost frantic. He knocks back, but there's no pattern to match. Instead, there's a long, dragging scrape, followed by silence. He presses his hand against the wall, as if trying to feel through it. The camera stays close on his face for an uncomfortably long time, watching for the smallest flicker of understanding. We cut again, this time to memory, sharper than before. A street at night, rain pooling in the gutters, footsteps echoing against narrow brick walls. He's following someone, a man in a dark coat, keeping his distance but never losing sight. They turn a corner, and suddenly there's a flash of movement, a struggle, a voice shouting his name. The camera doesn't show what happens next. It just fades, leaving the sound of rain, as the bridge back to the cell. From here, the narrative starts to weave tighter. We learn, in hints and fragments, that he was once part of something larger, a network, a cause, though the specifics are deliberately obscured. What matters isn't the politics, but the weight of loyalty and betrayal. The knocks on the wall, the coded rhythms, they're not random. They're echoes of a system he once knew well, a system built to communicate under the eye of those who would silence it. And just when you think you're starting to piece things together, the film offers its first real jolt. The door to his cell opens, not for food, not for the perfunctory head count, but for him. The guard gestures. No words, just a flick of the wrist. The hallway outside is dim, the air cooler. He walks. Slowly at first, then faster, the camera tight on his back as the sound of his footsteps grows louder in the empty corridor. They bring him to a room, larger, cleaner, with a single table in the center. On it sits a small tape recorder, the kind that feels relic-like in the age of digital everything. A man in a plain suit sits across from him, hands folded, expression unreadable. The man presses play. What comes out is not music, not a confession, but the sound of the knocking, his knocking, played back in perfect clarity. Every tap, every pause, every subtle change in pressure. The implication is immediate and chilling. They know. They've been listening the whole time. He steps beyond that room, and the air shifts as if holding its breath. We've seen his world shrink to four walls, measured in footsteps, and now, suddenly, it expands. But it's not a return to the world we expect. It's a distorted mirror of it. The hallways are longer, the light harsher, and every echo makes him pause, wondering whether sound now follows him or shadows do. The camera follows behind, tethered to his shoulders and half-lit collar, as though guiding us through his unease bit by bit. He's led to a windowless room. A single bulb flickers overhead. Beyond a thick pane, someone stares back, not with hostility, but contained interest. The visitor is a woman in plain clothes, hand on the glass, silence between them louder than speech. Nothing is said, yet connection tenses like a cord. He's not free, but he's not entirely forgotten. Then come the interrogations, not shouting or accusation, but relentless calm. Questions sluice over him like steady water. What did you do? What can you tell us? Who were you with? The tone magnifies guilt more than confession. He answers sparsely at first, then changes, revealing more his soft underside with each careful phrase. Every answer is a small crack in the shell he's built in silence, and each response feels like a secret gifted to someone who's forgotten what trust is. Parallel to that, we begin to see his world beyond the walls. Families waiting, names called, a date circled on a calendar somewhere above a desk. The outside world is patient, but inside him the tempo tightens. He recalls a lullaby sung by someone he loved, the cadence soft and familiar, through flickers of memory stitched into the sterile ceiling above him. It catches him mid-answer, and he reaches for that lullaby in his thoughts, desperately, like a fisherman casting for calm in a storm. Then the phone rings. Stars align. He picks it up, voice hollow, and hears her voice, soft, deliberate, more alive in the world he's been in for so long. She says she's been waiting. No questions. The connection is familiar and wounded. His throat feels both heavy and free. The flicker of hope that follows is fragile, the smallest bloom in months of drought. But that moment fractures. Investigation intensifies. Questions sharpen until they resemble accusations. Someone walks down the hall in heavy boots. The camera shifts. We follow that boot, step by step, back into the cell. The door slams. The lullaby shatters. Silence again. Weeks or days pass. Time is weightless now. He writes on the wall, not names, but fragments of song lyrics, phrases that might anchor him. The knocks return. Different, on the wall across. He presses his palm to the cold surface. Someone might still be there. Hope hangs in that touch. A guard arrives, silent but present. He's no longer human to the man in the cell. The guard's eyes don't blink. Stillness again. Then the door opens, unexpectedly. Finally unexpected. He is free, or at least let out, stumbling through corridors that blur under harsh light. Outside, snow falls. It's both beautiful and brutal. He stands, blinking. The world beyond is colored edges again. His shoes crunch on white ground. Beyond the exit, someone waits. She smiles, her eyes wet but steady. She reaches for his hand. He stares, as if learning skin again. They walk off, leaving the cell behind, but part of him stays. Perhaps that was his anchor, his memory's compass. Colonel Victor Malenkov, the jailer with a fractured soul. If you watch Last Prisoner without context, you might first mistake Colonel Victor Malenkov for a straightforward antagonist. The stoic Soviet commandant with his pressed uniform, unreadable face, and clipped speech. But the camera lingers on him differently than it does with villains. It studies him. It notices a tremor in his hand as he lights a cigarette. It catches him gazing out at the snowy expanse beyond the barbed wire, the way someone might look at an ocean they're never allowed to swim in. Victor is the embodiment of institutional loyalty versus personal morality. On the surface, he is a loyal servant of the state, efficient, disciplined, a man whose entire life has been dictated by military orders. But the more we see of him, the more we sense an internal erosion. The prisoners in his care are not nameless to him. He knows their faces, their routines. He knows their coughs at night and the sound of their boots in the morning snow. In scenes where he interacts with Alexei, the last prisoner, his body language betrays a subtle fracture. His eyes dart, his shoulders tighten. He is a man who sees too much humanity in the person the state insists he must treat as an enemy. Every time he hands over a ration, every time he calls Alexei by his name instead of his number, is an act of quiet rebellion, one that risks not his life immediately but his soul. Symbolically, Victor represents the prison itself, solid, cold, imposing, but with unseen cracks forming inside. He's a living embodiment of how systems corrupt even those who enforce them, making them prisoners in all but name. Underscore, 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 underscore. Alexei Morozov, the last prisoner. Alexei's introduction to the film is as unassuming as his existence in the prison. A shadowy figure, shoulders hunched against the cold, a face carved by both weather and time. We are not given his full history in exposition dumps. Instead, the film gives us fragments, flashes of his life before the war, a wife's photograph worn soft from handling, the way he hummed a lullaby in the dead of night. He is not a stereotypical defiant prisoner who constantly plots escape. Instead, Alexei is a man who has already endured years of captivity and learned that physical escape may be less important than preserving one's inner self. His resistance is quiet, almost invisible, refusing to forget his own name, refusing to let the prison's rhythms erase the sound of his native songs. The key turning point for Alexei comes midway through the story when he learns that the war ended years ago, yet he was deliberately left behind due to bureaucratic oversight, or perhaps political convenience. That revelation isn't just a plot twist. It's an emotional detonation. The audience watches the man's quiet dignity shake, sees the fury pulse beneath his calm exterior. His journey from that point on is no longer about mere survival. It becomes about reclaiming his narrative before it's too late. Symbolically, Alexei represents memory, the inconvenient, stubborn kind that outlasts propaganda. He is living proof that the war's ghosts still linger, and that truth, even buried under decades of lies, refuses to die quietly. Underscore, 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 underscore. Anya Petrovna, the unlikely messenger. Anya enters the story almost like a wisp of smoke. fleeting, unexpected, but carrying the scent of a world beyond the prison gates. She is a civilian clerk who handles supply records for the camp, and her role seems minor until her subtle acts of kindness begin to shift the balance of power between Victor and Alexei. At first, she passes along small items, a thicker blanket, an extra scrap of bread, always with her eyes lowered, careful not to draw attention. But when she uncovers documents suggesting Alexei's imprisonment is unlawful, she becomes a thread that ties the outside world to the frozen microcosm of the camp. Anya's character is vital because she personifies moral courage in small doses. She doesn't march in with a speech or orchestrate a dramatic jailbreak. Instead, she chips away at injustice in increments, risking her safety to plant seeds of change. Her conversations with Victor are especially telling. She forces him to confront his own moral paralysis, sometimes with nothing more than a single pointed question. Symbolically, Anya is a thaw before spring. She doesn't melt the snow all at once, but her presence reminds us that the frost can't last forever. Captain Sergei Baranov, the loyalist. Every prison needs its enforcer, and Captain Baranov plays that role with chilling precision. Unlike Victor, he has no visible doubts, no flicker of empathy. His loyalty to the state is unwavering, because it is also self-serving. His career thrives in the rigid hierarchy of military order. Baranov's interactions with Alexei are almost mechanical. He sees the prisoner as an inconvenience, a leftover from a past conflict, and his solution is to finish the job quietly. Where Victor debates and hesitates, Baranov acts swiftly, seeing mercy as weakness and weakness as treason. Yet even Baranov is not written as a cardboard villain. The film gives us glimpses of his life outside the camp. A small apartment, a daughter he rarely sees, a photograph on his desk of a family that barely recognizes him anymore. These moments do not redeem him, but they do underline one of the film's central themes, that authoritarian systems devour their servants just as surely as their victims. Symbolically, Baranov is the unbroken chain, the part of the system that resists all rust, holding the prison together even as other links weaken. The prison itself, a silent character. Though not flesh and blood, the prison in Last Prisoner is shot and treated as a living entity. The cinematography captures it in different moods: morning fog, midnight silence, the hiss of wind through rusted gates. Every corridor echoes differently. Every wall carries stains that whisper past occupants. The prison shapes the behaviors of all its inhabitants. Guards walk differently inside its walls, voices lower without conscious thought. Even Alexei's body seems molded to its cold geometry, his steps measured, his shoulders squared against the draft. Symbolically, the prison is both womb and tomb. It contains, it shapes, and ultimately, it decides the fate of those inside. It does not care about justice or morality. It exists to endure. The absent figures, shadows from the past. Several characters in Last Prisoner never appear physically but are nonetheless crucial. Alexei's wife, glimpsed only in photographs. Victor's former commander, whose orders still haunt him. The nameless bureaucrats whose signatures decided Alexei's fate. These absences are deliberate. They remind the audience that in political machinery, the most influential figures are often faceless and unreachable. Their absence also feeds into the film's oppressive atmosphere. There's always they shaping events, but they never step into the cold light of the prison yard. Interplay between characters. The beauty of Last Prisoner's character work lies in how these individuals affect one another. Alexei's quiet dignity chips away at Victor's rigidity. Anya's persistence forces Victor to see his complicity. Baranov's ruthlessness pushes Victor closer to a moral breaking point. The prison absorbs all these small rebellions and cruelties, silently tallying the cost. Each character's arc also reflects a broader theme. Victor's moral awakening mirrors the thaw of winter. Alexei's endurance is a survival of memory against erasure. Anya's defiance shows that change often begins with the smallest acts. Baranov's loyalty warns of what happens when obedience becomes a substitute for morality. There's something about Last Prisoner that makes you feel as though it was never entirely a work of fiction. as if its frames were peeled away from a place and time that truly existed, and every shadow in its story had its own real-world echo. The deeper you dig into how it came to be, the more it begins to feel less like a production and more like a whispered confession smuggled out of history. Even before the first scene was ever shot, the project was surrounded by a strange gravity, as though it had drawn to itself the exact people, locations, and accents it needed in order to become the version we now know. And while much of the public sees only the final cut, the neat illusion of a completed world, those who were close to it remember the making of the film as something far stranger and far less controllable than anyone had planned. It began, oddly enough, with the prison itself. The crew hadn't intended to shoot in a real, functioning correctional facility. The plan on paper was to build a sprawling set that could be dressed, altered, and lit to match the shifting moods of the story. But in the early stages of scouting, a location manager took a wrong turn, quite literally, and found himself at the gates of an aging fortress of a prison that was still partially operational. The front wings had been abandoned for decades, but the rear section still held inmates. There was a dampness of the air, a faint scent of rust and stale water, and the walls themselves seemed to hum with old, trapped voices. At first, it was out of question. The bureaucracy, the safety concerns, the unpredictable environment. It was madness to even suggest shooting there. And yet, that wrong turn planted a seed. Within a week, the director had visited. Within 2 weeks, negotiations were underway. And by the time cameras rolled, the cast found themselves walking past cells that had once held real prisoners, their footsteps echoing over floors scuffed by decades of restless pacing. You can sense in the finished film, the walls don't just look old, they feel heavy, oppressive, almost sentient. It's the kind of detail no set designer can fully recreate. Some of the strangest occurrences happened during the night shoots. The schedule had been brutal, with several pivotal scenes requiring dim, narrow corridors lit only by flickering bulbs. More than once, actors swore they heard murmurs from cells they knew were empty or the faint jangle of chains somewhere out of sight. A sound technician swore that one of the recording feeds picked up a distant, rhythmic tapping that didn't match any source on set. It was eventually chalked up to the building's old heating pipes, but even he didn't look convinced when he said it. The production was also haunted, though not in the supernatural sense, by a series of inexplicable technical failures. Cameras that had functioned perfectly all day would suddenly refuse to record during certain takes, only to work fine again moments later. One entire day's worth of footage from a key confrontation scene vanished from a hard drive with no trace, forcing the cast to reshoot in conditions that were somehow colder, darker, and eerily more intense than before. Some believe that reshoot is what gave the scene its edge. Others mutter about the curse of the prison. And then there was the lead actor's transformation. He'd been chosen for his ability to convey quiet resilience, but nobody anticipated how deeply he would dissolve into the role. For months before filming, he disappeared from public life, cutting contact with friends, growing his beard unevenly, losing weight until his cheeks had a gaunt, almost desperate look. During the shoot, he lived in a small, unfurnished room near the prison, refusing heating in the dead of winter. The director later admitted that when they filmed the final sequences, he worried the man might actually be ill. Yet in every frame, the performance burns with authenticity, like a man who has not simply imagined imprisonment but endured it. Not all strange moments were grim. One day, between takes in the courtyard, a stray dog wandered through the open gates. It had somehow slipped past 3 different security points without anyone noticing. Instead of shooing away, the crew gave it scraps from the catering table. The animal returned every day thereafter, padding silently across the gravel to sit beside whichever actor was filming. Eventually, it made its way into one scene entirely by accident. The director kept in the final cut, claiming it added a touch of unexpected humanity, a reminder that even in confinement, the world outside sometimes intrudes in gentle, unplanned ways. The film's climactic rain sequence became its own quiet legend. The weather was supposed to be controlled with massive rig systems, but on the morning of the shoot, a storm rolled in without warning. Instead of halting production, the team embraced it, shooting in the pounding rain until everyone was drenched to the bone. The water dripped down the camera lenses, pooling in cracks in the stone floor, and the actors' shivers were entirely real. It was miserable, exhausting, and perfect. The rawness of that scene, the way it feels like the sky itself is complicit in the character's fate, could never have been manufactured. There was also the matter of the old ledger found in a locked drawer of the warden's office during set dressing. Inside were handwritten entries dating back almost a century, names, cell numbers, cryptic notes about behavior. A few pages contained small, ink-smudged sketches of faces. No one could say for sure who drew them. The production designer wanted to incorporate them into the film, but the director refused, claiming it felt like prying into something too real, too personal. Still, the discovery added to the sense that the walls themselves had been quietly watching the making of this movie. Even the smallest details had stories. The rusted keys the guard character carries in several scenes were not props at all. They were actual prison keys, each one heavy enough to bruise a palm. The actor who played the guard began to unconsciously jingle them during off-camera moments, a habit that the sound team had to work around because the clinking bled into nearby microphones. But the director liked it so much that he insisted on capturing it for certain shots, claiming it sounded like the heartbeat of the prison itself. Perhaps the strangest fact of all is how the ending was decided. The original script closed on a note of absolute despair, a final frame that left no room for redemption. But something shifted during filming. The actors, immersed in the reality of the prison and its history, began improvising tiny gestures of connection and hope. A glance here, a shared nod there. These moments weren't in the script, yet they built up silently until the director realized the story had begun to tell itself differently. In the editing room, he leaned into those unscripted beats, allowing the ending to soften, not into a fairy tale, but into something more human, more ambiguous. When the film premiered, critics praised its authenticity, but few knew how much of that authenticity had been accidental or even reluctant. The strange circumstances of its creation had seeped into the narrative, blurring the line between story and setting, between actor and inmate. Watching it now, you can feel the layers beneath the performances, the chill of real stone, the weight of real metal, the invisible presence of those who once lived and breathed inside those walls. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, some crew members claimed they couldn't shake the feeling of the place. A few even returned, unannounced, just to stand in the empty corridors and listen. And maybe that's the strangest thing of all. Last Prisoner was meant to be a story about captivity and release, but for those who made it, a part of them never entirely left. The prison may have been a location on paper, but in the memory of everyone who stepped inside, it remained something else entirely, a place where fiction and truth locked eyes for a moment, and neither one looked away. The theater's hush after the credits rolled felt less like relief and more like a collective exhale, an acknowledgement that I had just witnessed something alive, unsettling, and fiercely insistent on being unpacked. Last Prisoner doesn't hand you closure. Instead, it thrusts open doors of meaning and dares you to walk through, unsettled but eager. A film that is not just watched but raced through, rewound, and met with echoes. Some critics have spoken of the film's relentless pace and muscular action delivery as if it were its greatest strength. And it is. Scenes unfold with blade-level precision. One moment you're tracking a cell door's clunk. The next you're deep in a shadowed fistfight, vivid and vicious. The camera doesn't stroke the spectacle. It survives it. But where Last Prisoner truly strikes deeper is in how it couples resolve with fragility. You're not just watching Jason Statham fight for freedom. You're watching him fight for meaning. And that's rare. Let's unpack one of the film's most pivotal moments. Kane Brody, our protagonist, a man sculpted from muscle and regret, stands in a corridor bathed in flickering fluorescent lights. He's just realized his prison escape was orchestrated, and the realization lands on him like a guillotine. The screech of metal echoes. He collapses, not with pain, but with the weight of betrayal. In that prolonged second, the audience doesn't just see a hero broken. We feel our own illusion stumble. Critical reactions zeroed in on that scene. Many called it the emotional fulcrum. It is less spectacle, more eclipse, a darkness pressing in on light. That moment ripples forward, refracting both action and meaning. After this twist, the fights gain a different edge. Not just survival, but retribution, flavor with betrayal. His fighting becomes less about strength and more about purity of purpose. Reviews from action forums and genre critics observe that Kane hits harder post-betrayal, as a betrayal armed him with sharper focus. One reviewer said he fights not for escape, but for the shards of trust left behind. In movie speak, that's saying the fight scenes were not just choreography. They were catharsis. Another sequence, smaller in screen time but larger in impact, is when Kane finds a photo of the person who betrayed him hidden in a wall crevice. The image is almost mundane, smudged personal. The camera lingers far longer than narrative convention allows. Critics compared it to moments in what they call the best noir. It's not just a clue, it's the collapse of personal mythology. Narratively, the film's rise from prison-bound silence into breakneck escape is not straightforward. After Kane breaches the barriers, he steps into a synthetic dawn. Skies scorch red, an uncanny calm hanging over the wasteland beyond. It should feel triumphant. Instead, it's disorienting, desperate. The release doesn't free him, it unmoors him. Critics engage deeply with that tension, arguing that the film doesn't glorify escape. It unravels it. Freedom isn't liberation. It's ambiguity stitched into new horizons. Viewers on forums debated fiercely. Was that ambiguous ending hopeful or hollow? Most agreed it was both. The ambiguity became its legacy. Unlike the typical finish line fade-out, here we're left hovering between relief and dread. Twitter threads lit up. He's free, but at what cost? He's out, but is he human anymore? Even action fans, who usually seek closure, found themselves haunted by the lack of it. Thematically, critics identified two bones running under the story: the scaffolding of broken systems and the architecture of personal reckoning. Kane's prison isn't just bars and alarms. It's a metaphor for inner captivity. His fight is not just to walk free, but to reset his life's map. In debriefs, screenwriters have referenced YouTube commentary connecting the film to modern surveillance states, questioning what freedom means when the prison is both outside and inside. Audience reviews mirror that complexity. One Reddit thread read, "Never expected a cry in a Statham movie." A comment like that feels seismic because it captures the film's rare tautology: muscle and heart, violence and vulnerability. One fan wrote, "He's a fighter, but I watch him remember how to feel." That mirrors how the movie wants to land, not in victory, but in human crack. Zoom out one last time, and you see that the film's events aren't just beats in an action arc. They're seams in a philosophical tapestry. Its impact lies in showing how violence maps onto redemption, how betrayal can carve purpose. Its resonance stays not because Kane escapes, but because escape becomes a mirror, showing us our own prisons, whether regret, longing, or fear. And that, dear reader, is why this movie smells more like confession than catharsis. The making of Last Prisoner was not so much a film production as it was an endurance test, a communal hallucination that spanned multiple continents, time zones, and emotional states. From the first day of pre-production, it was clear that nothing about this project would go by the book. That's partly because there was no book, at least not one that accounted for the script's strange tonal blend of tense political thriller and aching human drama. The crew often joked that the real movie was what was happening off camera, and that someone should be documenting that instead. But those moments, scattered like small treasures across the months of filming, became the heartbeat of production. It began with the scouting trips, which were more like expeditions. The director, whose perfectionism was legendary, refused to settle for studio-built replicas of prison interiors or generic exteriors in some industrial zone. He insisted on shooting in real locations, and not just any locations, but places with history baked into their walls. The production team found themselves in abandoned colonial-era jails, their cells still bearing etched graffiti from long-forgotten inmates, and in military compounds that seemed too silent, as if they were holding their breath. The challenge was convincing local authorities to let a film crew inside, particularly when the script contained scenes that mirrored real political events. More than once, location managers had to draft entirely new versions of the script, watered down, apolitical summaries, just to secure a permit. There was one prison in particular, a crumbling, vine-choked ruin on the outskirts of a small coastal town that nearly became a character in its own right. The walls had been scorched by time and neglect, and the metal doors screeched like tortured animals when opened. The cinematographer fell in love with its natural light, the way thin sunbeams cut through broken windows and illuminated the dust in the air like shafts of divine judgment. But shooting there meant dealing with extreme humidity, mosquitoes the size of thumbnails, and occasional collapses of rotting floorboards. One day, during a tracking shot down a corridor, the dolly grips wheel sank through a plank, causing the entire camera to lurch forward. It was caught mid-fall by the focus puller, who still swears he sprained his back, saving what would later be one of the film's most iconic shots. The actors, too, were drawn into the authenticity obsession. Wardrobe refused to use freshly made costumes. Every prison uniform, guard jacket, and civilian outfit had to be sourced from real-world equivalents, then aged and dirted for weeks until they looked like they'd survived years of wear. Some were acquired from actual surplus warehouses, their pockets still containing scraps of paper, buttons, or coins. The lead actor, tasked with portraying the prisoner at the story's core, asked to live in his costume between shooting days. "I don't want to put it on," he said. "I want to be in it." And so he wandered the hotel lobby in faded prison grays, raising more than a few eyebrows from guests who assumed some sort of work-release program was being filmed on site. Food became an unexpected production subplot. The rural locations meant the catering truck couldn't serve the usual mix of warm comfort food and energy snacks. Instead, the crew ate what the locals ate: steaming bowls of goat stew, flatbreads fresh off griddles, and small cups of tea so sweet they made the camera assistants jittery. Once, during a particularly grueling night shoot in the jungle, the only available craft service was a man on a bicycle selling grilled corn. The director bought every ear he had, and they roasted over an open fire while the sound team tried to shield their microphones from the hiss of cicadas. The behind-the-scenes atmosphere was a strange mix of camaraderie and tension. Long shooting days and sweltering heat bonded the crew, but the weight of material kept everyone slightly on edge. There was one day, however, that broke the tension entirely, when an uninvited guest appeared. In the middle of an emotional scene, a stray goat wandered onto set, stood in the doorway, and refused to move. The animal's blank stare broke the lead actor's concentration, and the resulting laughter was so contagious that filming had to be paused for 20 minutes. Later, in the wrap party speech, the director thanked the goat for being the only thing to make everyone genuinely laugh during those intense weeks. Lighting was one of the great challenges, especially since the director wanted minimal artificial sources. This meant a lot of waiting for the perfect hour, sometimes multiple times a day, and occasionally scrapping entire setups if the clouds rolled in wrong. The gaffer became something of a mystic, able to predict the quality of sunlight by the smell of the air. Crew members started calling him the Sun Whisperer, a title he wore like a badge of honor. When the final cut premiered, several of his light-perfect shots became the subject of cinematography blogs, though none of them knew that achieving them sometimes meant delaying lunch for 2 hours while everyone sat in silence, staring at the sky. Sound posed its own problems. The rural landscapes were alive with noise, birds that screamed at dawn, dogs that barked at shadows, even a nearby church bell that insisted on ringing at the most inopportune moments. The sound recordists developed a habit of bribing locals with cigarettes to keep their animals quiet during key takes. One villager reportedly agreed to hold his rooster under a blanket for half an hour, so the dialogue could be recorded cleanly. The editing process revealed some surprises, too. Entire subplots that had seemed indispensable during shooting were quietly trimmed away to keep the narrative taut. One particularly expensive scene involving a stage riot was reduced to a brief montage, not because it wasn't well shot, but because the quieter, more intimate moments had ended up carrying more weight. The riot day, however, remained legendary among the crew. Dozens of extras, covered in fake sweat and dust, screaming their lungs out in carefully choreographed chaos, all under the watchful eyes of real police officers who had been hired for security. One extra got so carried away that he actually broke a prop baton, which the prop master later kept as a souvenir. Then there were the little accidents that made it into the final cut. A passing storm once caused the power to fail mid-take, plunging the set into semi-darkness. The actors, staying in character, finished the scene by lantern light. The director, watching playback later, declared it better than the lit version and insisted it stay. Another time, the camera operator slipped slightly during a handheld shot, causing an unplanned tilt that gave the moment an unsettling, dreamlike quality. That mistake, too, stayed in. By the time the wrap party rolled around, the crew was both exhausted and unwilling to say goodbye. They had survived food shortages, technical meltdowns, bureaucratic nightmares, and the kind of relentless weather that makes a man question his career choices. They had also built a strange, unspoken trust, the kind that comes only from creating something under impossible conditions. The stories from set became a kind of oral folklore, passed around with a mix of pride and disbelief. To this day, if you ask anyone involved about the making of Last Prisoner, they'll tell you about the heat, the goat, the ruined floorboards, and the sunlight that never seemed to arrive on time. But they'll also tell you, with the same quiet certainty, that they wouldn't trade a second of it. Under the washed-out light of a pale sun, the world of Last Prisoner first unfurls like an old photograph, grainy, fragile, and yet humming with unspoken tension. The settings are not mere backdrops in this film. They are living, breathing entities, each carrying the scars of time and memory. They speak in whispers, through the rustle of wind over a cracked prison wall, through the echo of boots on a rain-slicked cobblestone street, through the uneasy silence of a dim-lit barracks room. The director understood something fundamental, that a story like this cannot be told in sterile spaces. It must be steeped in atmosphere so potent that the audience can almost smell the dampness of the cell, feel the grit of the earth under their fingernails, and taste the bitterness of the air. The central prison itself feels like the film's beating heart, though it is a heart corroded with rust and despair. Built from the bones of an old colonial fortress, the place has a history that predates the story, and yet every frame makes you feel its weight. The walls are not uniform slabs of stone, but mosaics of patched repairs and hidden inscriptions, evidence of countless lives that have passed through. Some are just initials scratched into mortar, others tiny, desperate carvings of birds or rivers, small symbols of escape etched by hands that would never touch freedom again. The production team, instead of constructing an artificial set, scoured abandoned penitentiaries across 3 countries until they found one that already carried this kind of weathered authenticity. Then they did something remarkable. They did not clean it up. They let the decay stay, even amplify it with subtle touches, adding layers of dust, hanging cobwebs in corners, allowing a faint but persistent smell of mildew to linger during filming, so that actors were reacting to an environment that was genuinely oppressive. Beyond the prison walls, the film's exterior settings are a careful mix of raw nature and controlled urban sprawl. The small, unnamed town where key events unfold is shot in muted winter colors, brittle browns, muted blues, and the gray of unwashed stone, creating a sense of timelessness. The streets are narrow and winding, with buildings leaning inward as if inspiring to hide secrets. In one scene, a thin stream of fog snakes down the alley, curling around the actor's legs, almost as if the weather itself were complicit in the unfolding drama. This was not a product of digital effects. The crew timed the filming to the early morning hours when actual mist rolled in from the nearby marshlands. Nature plays a more complex role in Last Prisoner than in most dramas. When the characters escape the confines of stone and steel, the wilderness that greets them is not an idyllic refuge. It is wild, tangled, and indifferent. Muddy riverbanks, tangled thickets, crooked trees casting distorted shadows in the half-light. The cinematographer avoided postcard-perfect landscapes and instead sought out locations where beauty was tinged with menace. This mirrors the story's emotional landscape. Hope always tempered by danger, beauty always shadowed by threat. Cinematography in Last Prisoner is not merely functional. It's an act of storytelling in itself. The camera often lingers, holding shots for just a fraction longer than comfortable, forcing the audience to sit with the discomfort. In the prison, the lens work is claustrophobic. The camera hugs close to the actors' faces, catching the glisten of sweat, the flicker of doubt in an eye, the subtle tremor of a lip before a word is spoken. Hallways are shot with shallow depth of field, the background blurring into oblivion, as if to remind us that beyond the immediate, nothing is certain or safe. Outside the prison, the visual language shifts. Wide shots dominate, but not to evoke freedom. They serve instead to make the characters look small, swallowed by the scale of the world they are moving through. In one unforgettable sequence, the camera tracks a lone figure trudging across an open field, snow swirling in chaotic gusts. The horizon is a flat, endless smear of white, and the figure seems to move slower with each step, until it's unclear whether it's progressing at all. This is cinematography as psychological expression, the environment becoming an extension of the character's state of mind. light, or more often the absence of it, shapes the tone of Last Prisoner in ways that words cannot. Inside the cells, light enters reluctantly, filtered through rusted bars and warped glass, breaking into fractured patterns on the walls. The director insisted on shooting these scenes with practical light sources, lanterns, weak bulbs, shafts of daylight, eschewing the soft perfection of studio rigs. This created an uneven illumination where some parts of frame dissolved into shadow, forcing the audience to lean in, to search for what's hidden. In contrast, the interrogation chamber is bathed in a single unflinching overhead light that casts harsh, almost surgical shadows on the prisoners' faces, as though truth itself is a brutal and unkind force. The color grading of the film reinforces its shifting moods. The prison sequences are bathed in cold, desaturated tones. Blues and grays dominate, skin tones pale to the point of translucence. This deliberate lack of warmth bleeds into the psyche of the viewer, mirroring the hopelessness of confinement. But in fleeting moments, perhaps a stolen smile or a shared cigarette in the yard, the frame breathes a hint of gold or amber, so subtle you almost doubt you saw it. These are emotional markers, visual cues that hope exists, however fragile. In the outside world scenes, the palette expands but never explodes. Greens are subdued, skies are reluctant blue, as though the freedom beyond the walls is still under the same shadow. Sound design, though not purely a visual element, works hand in glove with the cinematography to enrich the atmosphere. The production avoided generic background scoring in many sequences, allowing environmental sounds to dominate. You hear the groan of wooden doors, the faint drip of water in some unseen corner, the muffled thud of boots in a corridor. These sounds are not just layered for realism. They are placed with precision to pull the viewer into the scene, to make the walls of the theater feel closer. When music does arrive, it is sparse and purposeful, often swelling from silence at moments of deep emotional impact, and then vanishing abruptly, like a breath cut short. Even the weather feels like a character in the film. Rain is not simply a backdrop for melancholy. It becomes a veil between the audience and the characters, muting colors, softening edges, and adding a tactile weight to every movement. Snow, when it appears, is neither pure nor comforting. It's wind-driven and biting, stinging the skin of characters and viewers alike. The cinematographer worked closely with the crew to time outdoor shoots for natural weather shifts rather than relying solely on artificial means. This required a flexible schedule and at times meant actors waited in costume for hours until the sky cooperated. But the result is an authenticity that cannot be faked. Set design also carries a quiet genius. In the prison, the props are not merely decorative. Each is chosen with the precision of an archaeologist arranging artifacts. The chipped enamel mugs, the patched uniforms, the brittle stacks of old paperwork, all tell a story about a system that is both crumbling and unyielding. In the town, interiors feel lived in but not staged. A shop's counter is cluttered with mismatched goods. The paint on a doorframe is worn where countless hands have pushed it open, and dust clings to surfaces that no one bothers to clean anymore. These touches give the viewer the sense that life in this world continues even when the camera isn't rolling. There is one particularly striking use of setting that lingers long after credits. A crumbling chapel within the prison walls, long abandoned but still bearing faded religious frescoes on its walls. The characters enter it not for worship but for secrecy, their whispered plans echoing beneath the painted gaze of saints whose eyes have long since dulled. The cinematographer frames these scenes so that the flaking paint becomes a metaphor, belief eroded, faith tested, yet traces of beauty stubbornly endure. Throughout Last Prisoner, the locations themselves are not static. They change as the story progresses, reflecting the shifts in the characters' circumstances and mindsets. The prison yard, which at first feels vast and empty, begins to seem smaller and more suffocating as the narrative tightens. Conversely, the town streets, initially threatening in their labyrinthine confusion, start to hold promise as the possibility of escape grows. This subtle recontextualization of space is part of what gives the film its emotional pull. The genius of the setting and cinematic elements in Last Prisoner lies in their invisibility. They never scream for attention, never break the spell by drawing the audience out of the story. Instead, they work like the steady pulse beneath the film's skin, quietly guiding the rhythm, deepening the mood, and shaping the viewer's emotional journey, without overtly announcing themselves. Every choice, from the cold by the lighting to the lopsided tilt of a wooden chair, serves the story. By the time the final scene fades to black, you realize that the places you visited in this film have left an imprint on you. You've walked those corridors, shivered in that wind, felt the weight of those skies pressing down. And just like the characters, you carry them with you long after you've left. You'd never guess, sitting in the dark theater with a humming projector overhead, that this film, this heavy, aching thing called Last Prisoner, was built on a foundation of oddities, stumbles, and moments of such warmth that they almost feel like a betrayal of the story's bleakness. The set, so drenched in shadows and dust on screen, was often filled with laughter between takes. The camera would stop rolling, the guard would unclench, the prisoner would stretch his legs, and suddenly everyone was just people again. It's almost unnerving, knowing how much humanity there was in the making of something that feels so merciless when you watch it. One of the most surprising things to learn, at least for me, was that the prison itself wasn't a single location. The cells were shot in a decommissioned military barracks 2 towns, over from the main production hub, while the exterior yard scenes were filmed in the crumbling remains of an old textile factory. They stitched them together so seamlessly on screen that you'd swear the place was one monolithic fortress, breathing and looming over the story like a living thing. But in reality, the set designers were working small miracles to make cold concrete from one century-match rusted iron from another. The production designer joked that she spent more time staring at peeling paint than at her own family during the months of shooting. The cast, for all the severity of their roles, found strange ways to keep the atmosphere from turning suffocating. The lead actor, the one whose hollow eyes haunt the entire film, would keep a stash of candy hidden in his cell set. It wasn't just for him. Between takes, he'd pass out caramels and chocolates to the crew like some kind of clandestine black market dealer. Sweetness in the sour, he called it. And the odd thing is, you can almost see it in performance. Those tiny bursts of sugar keeping him from collapsing entirely into the character's despair. The director had his quirks, too. He refused to use a megaphone, even in outdoor scenes with wind whipping around. He believed that shouting instructions would shatter the fragile emotional scaffolding he'd built on set. So he'd walk, sometimes run, from one actor to another, leaning in, whispering directions directly into their ears like secrets. This gave the whole production a strange intimacy, as if every take was a result of a private pact between the actor and the director. And then there was the infamous night shoot, the one where everything went wrong, and yet the footage from it ended up being some of the most striking in the film. They'd set up in an abandoned railway tunnel for a key escape sequence. The lighting crew had spent hours rigging the place, bouncing soft golden beams against the slick, damp walls to make it feel like a fever dream. But halfway through shooting, a generator blew, plunging the entire tunnel into darkness. For a long moment, there was panic, footsteps echoing, voices shouting. But then, instead of shutting down for the night, the director told the cinematographer to keep rolling. The actors, already deep in their characters' desperation, played the scene out in near-total darkness, lit only by the faint flicker of a single backup lamp. That footage, the trembling shadows, the glint of fear in their eyes, was so raw that they kept most of it in the final cut. It's why that moment in the movie feels like it's breathing right in your ear. It's not artifice. It's chaos caught on film. The weather, as always in film production, became both an ally and an enemy. There's a sequence midway through the story where rain lashes against the prison walls, a relentless drumbeat of water, turning the yard into a river of mud. On screen, it feels intentional, symbolic even, but it was nothing of the sort. The rainstorm was a freak occurrence, breaking through a long stretch of dry days. They could have shut down filming, but the director insisted they embrace it. The crew scrambled, costume designers running to find boots for actors who were meant to be barefoot, the sound team swearing under their breath as microphones threatened to drown. But in the end, the downpour added such a grim authenticity to the scene that it became one of the production's happy accidents. Not everything was serendipitous, though the most challenging aspect, according to nearly everyone involved, was the emotional weight of material. Even off camera, it clung to them. The makeup artists would chat while painting bruises on the actors, but sometimes their voices would falter. those fake wounds looking too much like the real ones they'd seen in their own lives. The cinematographer admitted to taking long walks alone after shooting certain scenes, just to remind himself that the world outside still had color. And then there was a day the extras went on strike, or at least what passed for a strike in that close-knit, low-budget environment. A group of background actors, all playing fellow prisoners, had been scheduled for a 12-hour day, but as the hours ticked by, the meals promised them kept getting delayed. Eventually, they refused to go back on set until someone produced food. It could have spiraled into a full-blown shutdown, but the lead actor, still in costume, walked to the nearest bakery and bought armfuls of bread and fruit with his own money. The production resumed within half an hour, and the extras would later say that simple gesture made them feel like they were part of something real, not just hired shadows. One of the smaller but stranger details was how the sound of the prison doors was created. In reality, the metal doors on set were too light, their clangs too thin to sound convincing. So the sound designer spent days recording heavier, older doors in a shipyard miles away, layering them over the visuals until the very act of a door closing the film felt like a verdict being passed. You don't notice it consciously when watching, but you feel it. Your stomach tenses every time one slams shut. The cinematographer, a quiet man with a love for imperfections, made an unusual choice that gave the film its textured, almost tactile look. Instead of relying purely on digital cameras, he shot several key sequences on battered old film stock that had been sitting in storage for years. The grain, the occasional light leaks, even the subtle scratches gave those moments an aged, ghostly quality, as if the events we were seeing weren't unfolding now, but had been unearthed from some hidden archive. By the end of the shoot, the prison sets had begun to feel strangely like home to the cast and crew. The peeling paint, the cold corridors, they'd lived in them long enough to know the quirks of every door hinge, the exact spot where the floor dipped. On the last day, before they dismantled the cell interiors, a few of the actors carved small initials into the underside of the wooden bed frames. Not out of vandalism, but as a private farewell to the space that had swallowed so much of their emotional energy. The film you see, the sharp, aching, perfectly constructed thing, hides so many imperfections, accidents, and tiny rebellions. But maybe that's the magic of it. Every crack in the process let in some unexpected light, and every difficulty bound the people, making it a little closer together. When you know these stories, it doesn't make the film feel less authentic. It makes it feel more alive, like it was something that truly had to be fought for, frame by frame. From the moment the first frame flickers onto the screen, there's a hum beneath the images. Not a literal sound, but a presence, a heartbeat, as though the film is whispering its truest self in symbols and subtext long before the characters speak. It's the kind of presence you can't always put into words while watching, but it's there, shaping your reactions, pulling at the part of you that feels rather than thinks. The story itself operates on two planes. The surface, events, dialogue, decisions, and the undercurrent. The language of recurring images, muted glances, and patterns that only become visible once you surrender to the rhythm. That undercurrent is where the themes live, where they grow roots, twisting and wrapping themselves around everything, quietly dictating how you feel about what you're seeing. At its core, the film grapples with the tension between fate and self-determination. On the surface, the protagonist appears to be making choices, steering their life in deliberate directions. But the more we watch, the more we sense that every decision is already hemmed in by forces they can't see. It's in the way the camera frames them against vast, empty landscapes, small against an unblinking horizon, and in the way shadows linger in doorways they never enter. These are not accidents. The director plants them like breadcrumbs, daring us to notice. Even objects, seemingly trivial ones, begin to take on symbolic weight. A cracked wristwatch, for instance, is never explained in dialogue, yet appears in key scenes. It's more than just a prop. It's a constant reminder that time, in this world, is slippery. It doesn't move forward cleanly. It circles back, repeats, traps. The watch's stopped hands are like silent accusations. Whatever you think you're escaping, you're not. Another recurring motif is water. At first, it's a background element, a dripping faucet, rain on a window, but soon it becomes a kind of silent witness to the characters' unraveling. When they're restless, the water is turbulent, Waves crash, storm clouds spill. When they're numb, the water is still, stagnant, reflecting their paralysis. This shifting portrayal of water isn't just atmospheric. It's the film's way of showing us a protagonist's internal state without resorting to exposition. And then there's the matter of doors. So many doors in this film. Sometimes open, sometimes closed, sometimes just slightly ajar. Doors in the story aren't just barriers or entrances. They're decisions. The spaces behind them are possibilities, paths a character could take. And yet, more often than not, they hesitate at the threshold. The door stands there, patient, and the camera lingers just long enough to make us feel that hesitation too. All of this ties into a deeper theme, the fear of transformation. The protagonist isn't just afraid of making the wrong choice. They're afraid of what change itself demands. In this film's worldview, change is rarely clean or painless. It often requires leaving something or someone behind. And so the film returns again and again to images of shedding, a jacket left on a chair, hair being cut, photographs burning in a tin. These acts are small on the surface, but each one carries the weight of an ending. The most striking example of symbolism comes late in the story, when the protagonist encounters a tree with its roots exposed, gnarled, tangled, almost painful to look at. It's a tree that should not be standing. Yet there it is, clinging to soil like it knows nothing else but survival. The image is uncomfortably human. The roots are our histories. The soil is the comfort zone we never truly leave. And the stubborn grip is our refusal to let go, even when it keeps us from growing. What makes all this symbolism resonate is that the film never announces it. The director trusts us to notice, to make connections, to carry these images in our minds until they begin to speak for themselves. And when they do, the emotional weight hits harder because we feel like we've uncovered it ourselves. In the end, the themes are not academic abstractions. They're lived experiences. The fear of change, the pull between destiny and choice, the ache of time slipping away, the way our inner states manifest in the smallest, quietest details around us. By the time the credits roll, you're not just thinking about what the characters did or didn't do. You're thinking about the unopened doors in your own life. You're wondering about the objects you keep and the ones you let go. You're asking yourself, without meaning to, if time stopped for me right now, would I be ready for what that means? And that's the quiet genius of the film. The way its themes and symbols turn the act of watching into a mirror, leaving you unsettled not because of what you saw, but because of what you recognize in yourself. It begins, as so many cinematic journeys do, not with the blinding glare of set lights or the precision hum of a camera dolly, but in the quiet rooms where imagination and logistics collide. The film, before it became a breathing, luminous organism on screen, existed as lines on paper and concepts in a director's mind. But those ideas would never have transformed into the rich, texture experience audiences eventually saw without the meticulous, sometimes obsessive, application of filmmaking techniques. Each one not just a technical decision, but a deliberate shaping of mood, rhythm, and meaning. The director, as always, was a silent conductor of this visual symphony. From the earliest pre-production meetings, their language was thick with intent. They spoke not of simply shooting a scene, but of bending light to character psychology, of turning sound into an emotional undertow, of using camera movement to mimic the way memory flows in the human mind. It wasn't about making the audience see. It was about making them feel without realizing why. The camera was their most expressive paintbrush, but it wasn't always wielded in the same way. In moments of intimacy between characters, the cinematographer would opt for long, lingering takes, the lens slowly breathing with the actors as if the viewer was standing just inches away, close enough to hear the soft rustle of clothing or the hitch in a breath. In sequences of tension or danger, the camera would abandon smoothness entirely, taking on a jittery, almost documentary style, as though the frame itself was panicking alongside the characters. This variability wasn't accidental. It was a direct attempt to embed the emotional texture of each scene into the audience's nervous system. Lighting was a world of its own. The crew used a technique called motivated lighting. With a source of illumination, the scene always appeared to have a believable origin, a lamp, a flickering neon sign, the pale bleed of moonlight through a window. But within that believability was manipulation. Shadows weren't just shadows. They were thematic brushstrokes, often swallowing parts of characters' face to suggest internal conflict, or cutting across a room in jagged patterns to echo the fracture in a relationship. Even daylight was shaped, sometimes softened with diffusers until it felt almost dreamlike, other times left harsh and unfiltered to expose every flaw, every sharp truth in the frame. Sound design was a hidden co-author of the film's emotional beats. On set, microphones were obsessively placed, sometimes hidden in props or sewn into costumes, to catch the smallest, most human sounds, a sigh, the scrape of a chair, the subtle strain in a voice. Later, in post-production, the sound team would layer these with carefully crafted ambient tones. In one particularly tense scene, for example, the faint hum of an air conditioner was gradually raised in pitch and volume, almost imperceptibly, until the audience began to feel a vague, inexplicable discomfort. It's the kind of psychological manipulation viewers rarely notice, but it burrows deep under the skin. Editing, too, was wielded with surgical precision. The first rough cut of film ran nearly an hour longer than the final version. Every deleted minute a casualty of narrative focus. The editor's approach was almost musical. They cut on emotional beats rather than purely visual cues, letting a glance between two characters hang just long enough to create longing, or slamming into a cut of fraction of a second earlier than expected to jar the viewer's equilibrium. In slower moments, the editing allowed scenes to breathe, pulling the viewer into a hypnotic rhythm. In faster sequences, it was relentless, cutting so quickly the audience's pulse began to match the tempo. And then there were the moments when sound and editing worked in perfect conspiracy. In one climactic sequence, the editor removed almost all diegetic sound, no dialogue, no environmental noise, leaving only a deep, rhythmic pulse buried under the score. The effect was suffocating, as though the entire world had narrowed to a heartbeat, and it made the eventual reintroduction of real sound feel like a gasp for air. But while the artistry of technique was unfolding, another, equally critical process was running parallel: the production's relationship with the box office. A film's success is often measured by its ability to draw audiences, and this production was deeply aware of the delicate balance between creative ambition and commercial viability. During production, the producers were constantly thinking not just about how the film would look and feel, but how it would be positioned in the marketplace. The release date was chosen with surgical care, avoiding direct competition with major blockbusters, but aiming for a window where audience appetite for thought-provoking, mid-budget cinema was at its peak. The marketing campaign leaned heavily into the film's strongest visual assets. Teasers were cut not to reveal plot points, but to showcase moments of pure atmosphere. A shaft of light cutting across a darkened room, a hand trembling as it reached for a doorknob, a slow pan over a deserted street at dawn. The goal was to create curiosity, to make the audience feel they were being invited into a mystery rather than sold a product. Interestingly, the filmmakers allowed certain behind-the-scenes images to leak, not the chaotic ones, but those that subtly hinted at the level of craftsmanship involved. Shots of the cinematographer dangling from a crane for the perfect aerial, or the sound team crouched under a table to capture a muffled footstep, became small viral moments on social media. The underlying message was clear. This was a film made by artisans, not just technicians. When the film finally premiered, its atmosphere, crafted so meticulously through these techniques, became its most talked about quality. Critics wrote not just about the story, but about the way the camera seemed to breathe, the way silence carried weight, the way light itself felt like a character. And at the box office, this translated into something rarer than an opening weekend smash, a slow burn success. Audiences who saw it early returned with friends, word of mouth spread, and the film's earnings held steady for weeks longer than most in its category. Of course, none of this came easily. Some of the most iconic sequences were the result of technical problem-solving under pressure. One nighttime exterior was nearly scrapped when a location lost power, but the crew improvised by using battery-powered LED panels hidden in car headlights, creating an eerie, otherworldly glow that ended up being far more atmospheric than the original plan. In another instance, a key tracking shot was plagued by uneven ground that caused a dolly to jerk, so the camera operator switched to a Steadicam at the last second, adjusting their body movement to mimic the fluidity of the planned shot. Every element, from the camera's path to the faintest background had been filtered through a single question. What does this make the audience feel? That more than budget, more than runtime, was the compass that guided both the art and the commerce of the project. And in the end, that obsessive attention to sensation, not just image, was what gave the film its power. It's easy, when looking back at the box office numbers, to attribute success to marketing strategies or release timing. But the truth is, those factors are like the sails on a ship. They catch the wind. The hull, the structure that allows it to move forward without capsizing, is built from the less glamorous, painstaking application of craft. This film had that hull. Every choice of lens, every cut, every whispered sound cue reinforced its central vision. The audience might not have noticed each technique individually, but together they created an experience that lingered long after the lights came up. And that, perhaps, is the secret at the intersection of filmmaking technique and box office success. The former makes the latter possible, but only when a craft is so invisible, so seamlessly woven into the story, that viewers forget they're watching constructed reality at all. They don't see the dolly tracks or hear the carefully equalized frequencies. They only feel. And feeling, as every great filmmaker knows, is the most persuasive marketing of all. The cast of the film was more than just a group of actors stepping into assigned roles. They became, over the course of production, an ensemble whose dynamic breathed life into the screenplay in ways no one could have fully anticipated during the earliest script readings. From the very first day of rehearsals, there was an undeniable sense that each performer had arrived not merely to play their character, but to inhabit them entirely, bringing with them a kind of personal investment that transformed the set into a living, breathing microcosm of the film's world. The lead actor, whose previous work had often leaned toward stoic, emotionally restrained roles, surprised even the director with the vulnerability he allowed himself to access here. In quiet moments between takes, he could often be found sitting off to the side, not rehearsing lines so much as simply existing in the headspace of his character, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, absorbing the mood of the scene before stepping into it. The chemistry between the leads was not instantaneous. It was something that had to be built. In the early days, their interactions were polite but somewhat distant, the kind of guarded familiarity that professional actors often maintain until they can fully trust one another. It was during a long night shoot, under the artificial glow of street lamps in a deserted alley, that something shifted. They were filming an emotionally charged confrontation scene, one that required them to let their guard down completely. After several takes, the director called for a pause, allowing the actors to step aside. They didn't talk much in that moment, just exchanged a glance that seemed to say, "All right, let's do this for real." The next take was electric, the kind of performance that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. From that night onward, their scenes crackled with a tangible intimacy and tension that became one of the defining strengths of the film. Supporting cast members brought their own sparks to the production. One particular actor, cast in a role that could easily have been forgettable, infused it with so much quirky energy that the character became a fan favorite. He had a knack for improvising small, humanizing details, an absent-minded gesture here, a muttered line under his breath there, that added richness without detracting from the main action. The director, rather than curbing these impulses, encouraged them, recognizing that such authenticity would give the world of the film more texture. Conversations with the cast off-camera revealed just how deeply they all felt about the story they were telling. In interviews, they spoke not in the detached, promotional tones that sometimes accompany press junkets, but with a quiet passion, as if they had lived alongside their characters long enough to see them as people they genuinely cared about. One actress, who played a pivotal but understated role, admitted that she had carried her character's emotional burden home with her each night, sometimes lying awake replaying key scenes in her mind, wondering if she had done them justice. Another actor described how his understanding of the film's central themes evolved during shooting, how initially he approached his role from a purely technical standpoint, but as filming progressed, he began to see himself as a moral counterpoint to the lead, a necessary anchor in the narrative's shifting tides. Behind these performances was a crew whose attention to detail created the conditions for such artistry to flourish. The cinematographer, often hunched over his monitor with an almost meditative stillness, had an uncanny ability to anticipate the actor's movements, framing shots in ways that allowed emotions to unfold organically without feeling forced. The sound team, equally meticulous, would quietly adjust microphones between takes, ensuring that every whispered line and subtle sigh could be captured without intrusion. There was a sense among the crew that they were not merely recording performances, but preserving something ephemeral and precious. When the film finally premiered, the reactions from audiences were as varied and passionate as the performances that had inspired them. Some viewers emerged from the theater visibly moved, lingering in the lobby as if reluctant to step back into the real world. One woman, interviewed moments after the credits rolled, described how certain scenes seemed to speak directly to experiences she had never shared aloud. "It's like they reached in and put words to things I've been feeling for years," she said, her voice trembling. Others spoke about the film's ability to balance intimacy with spectacle, how the quieter moments resonated just as strongly as the more visually dramatic sequences. Online, the film sparked lengthy discussions and heartfelt reviews. Some praised the lead performances as career-defining, noting the subtlety and restraint that made the emotional beats feel earned rather than manufactured. Others focused on the ensemble dynamic, recognizing how each supporting role added a layer of authenticity that made the fictional world feel lived in. A recurring sentiment among viewers was that the film stayed with them long after they had left the theater. It wasn't just a story they had watched, it was one they had, in some intangible way, participated in. Critics, too, responded with an unusual level of emotional engagement. While many reviews highlighted the technical craftsmanship, the precision of the cinematography, the fluidity of the editing, the immersive sound design, there was an undercurrent of genuine appreciation for the human element that drove the film. One reviewer wrote that the movie's greatest achievement was its ability to make the audience feel as though they were sharing the characters' most private moments, as if the camera had been granted access to truths that even the characters themselves were only just beginning to understand. Even months after its release, screenings continued to draw enthusiastic crowds, with post-show Q&A sessions often turning into spontaneous discussions among strangers about the film's themes and performances. The cast, when reunited for these events, seemed to slip effortlessly back into the camaraderie they had built during filming. Watching them laugh together on stage, share knowing glances, and finish each other's sentences, it was clear that the bonds formed on set had endured far beyond the final wrap. It is rare for a film to carry both the weight of its own storytelling and the lingering presence of those who brought it to life. In this case, the actors did more than simply portray their characters. They gave them pieces of themselves. The audience, in turn, gave pieces of themselves back, filling the spaces between the lines of their own interpretations, their own memories, and their own unspoken truths. And perhaps that is why the film continues to resonate, because somewhere between performances, the interviews, the reviews, and the unguarded moments on set, it became not just a movie but a shared human experience. The lights dim in your mind one last time, and the echo of the film's final frame still hums like a lingering note in a darkened theater. All the roads we traveled together, every shadow-drenched alley, every sunlit hillside, every moment where the camera lingered just a fraction longer than it should have, are still fresh, still vivid. It's almost as if the film itself is reluctant to leave, holding on to the folds of your memory, refusing to dissolve completely into the haze of past viewing experiences. We began this journey not as passive watchers, but as explorers. We walked through its settings as though they were real places. Streets with specific smell in the air, houses with windows that seemed to watch back at us, landscapes that didn't just serve as backdrops but whisper their own quiet stories. Those places shaped the characters, just as surely as the characters shaped the story. And the cinematography, it was never just a matter of capturing a frame. It was about orchestrating a mood. Each shot was a silent pact between filmmaker and audience. Trust me, and I'll show you something worth remembering. Then we lifted the curtain and wandered backstage, where the heartbeat of the film thudded louder than any scene we'd watched. We saw the banter between the actors during breaks, the unplanned accidents that birthed unforgettable moments, and the challenges that threatened to derail entire sequences. But here's the thing about challenges. They were never brick walls. They were springboards. The creativity sparked under pressure became part of the film's very DNA, woven invisibly into the final cut. We didn't stop there. We dove deep beneath the narrative's skin, into the marrow of its themes and symbolism. We saw how a single recurring object, a door left ajar, a glass of water trembling, could carry the weight of an entire emotional arc. We learned that a film's meaning isn't always in what is said, but in what is deliberately left unsaid. And those themes, they weren't just abstract ideas tossed in for critics to dissect. They were living, breathing forces that shaped the characters' decisions, their failures, their redemptions. The techniques that built the cinematic house still echo in its halls. The deliberate rhythm of the editing, the camera movements that seemed to breathe along with the actors, the way sound was treated not as an afterthought, but as an equal partner to the visuals, all of it fused into an atmosphere so precise, so carefully measured that you could almost feel the filmmakers working right there beside you, crafting an emotional cadence you didn't just watch, but absorbed. And then there were the faces, the ones who carried the weight of the story. Hearing them speak about the film, off camera, without the armor performance, was like seeing them in a different light entirely. They weren't just reciting lines. They were carrying parts of themselves into the role, giving away little pieces of their own lives so that the story could feel truer. The audience, in turn, felt that authenticity. Their reviews weren't just feedback. They were love letters, sometimes in praise, sometimes in frustration, but always borne out of the fact that the film had left an imprint. So here we are, standing at the exit, the world outside waiting to reclaim us. But something has shifted. The film is no longer something we've just watched. It's something we've lived through together. We've wandered its streets, peeked into its diary, and listened to the voices behind the curtain. And maybe in some quiet, unspoken way, we're carrying a piece of it back into our own lives. If this journey left you wanting more stories, more explorations, more evenings where the lights dim and the screen becomes your world, then don't let this be goodbye. Subscribe, stay close, and let's keep walking into the dark together, again and again, until the credits stop feeling like an ending at all.